Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ, to our Bible study in the book of Ezra, and we're almost done. It seems like we just started. We're in Ezra chapter 9 today. Had to put the hat on. My hair is a disaster, and I didn't think you probably wanted to see that, so I'll spare you of that, and we'll look at our outline. How about that instead? We're keeping things pretty sparse on our first page today. Not a whole lot to go over, so we should go through it pretty quickly. Most of this is going to be a review for what we've already looked at in Ezra. So as far as our timeline, let's just take a look at the last two dates on that timeline, even though I leave the whole thing there for reference, maybe for people who are jumping into the chapter just here, or to the book just here in one of the later chapters. But the temple, which we were talking about its reconstruction for such a long time, it was finished in 516 BC. And then Ezra, about 60 years later, Ezra comes to Jerusalem from Babylonia in about 457 BC. There's several people mentioned in this chapter, but we're just going to kind of narrow in on the main ones, and that is the Jews. These are the descendants of Israel who were repopulating the land of Judah after returning to it following 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And then we have, of course, Ezra. He's a priest and a scribe who is skilled in the law of God, and he's going to call people to repentance and to adherence of the law of God in this chapter. And then for our map, we just have Jerusalem. It was the capital of the kingdom of Judah, and it was the location of God's temple that had recently been rebuilt, well, a couple decades before. In chapter 8, I mentioned that it was kind of a transition chapter of Ezra getting to Jerusalem, and then in chapter 9 and 10, he's really going to get to work. And that's what we're going to see here in chapter 9. There's a problem that needs solving in Jerusalem and in Judah, especially among some of the leading men. So let's talk about that now. Our first section is entitled Foreign Wives, the Sin of Judah, verses 1 through 15, and that's the whole chapter. After returning to Jerusalem, some of the Jews approached Ezra and they told him about a problem. Many of the leading men amongst the Jews, even the priests and the Levites, they were ignoring God's instructions and intermarrying with the idol-worshiping women of the land, non-Jewish people, people from other nations, who didn't share the same religious convictions as the Jews. This news was devastating to Ezra, and you see this in the way that he reacts. No doubt he was probably hoping to come back to Jerusalem and find the people in better spiritual health. But we do see a need for Ezra in coming to Jerusalem now. He wanted to come teach the laws of God. Well, he has his work cut out for him. He wrote this, quote, "I tore my garment and my cloak and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled." Ezra's fellow Jews, these individuals who also cared about the purity of the nation, they sat with Ezra until the evening sacrifice, at which time Ezra prayed to God about the condition of his people. He expressed his shame on behalf of his people's sins, and he quoted the instructions of God that his people were ignoring, the instructions that God had given to his people way back when they initially were able to inhabit the promised land after the exodus from Egypt. Now, in a sense, they've had a second exodus from Babylonia, and they're now again allowed to return to the promised land. But like the first time, they're not really listening to God. So this is the instruction they were ignoring, and these are the words of God. Quote, "The land that you are entering to take possession of it is a land impure with the impurity of the peoples of the land, with their abominations that have filled it from end to end with their uncleanliness. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever." The first time the people entered the promised land, they broke this command. They started intermarrying with the people, and they got in trouble for it. Now they're coming back into the promised land. They're intermarrying the people. They're going to get in trouble for it, unless there's some reforms. So this is Ezra's concern. He couldn't believe the Jews had returned to the sins, the same sins that had gotten their forefathers sent into captivity in Babylon, especially after God had showed them such incredible mercy and grace through the kings of Persia in their support of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. So that's where chapter 9 leaves off, as Ezra is in this state of despair and repentance and shame and guilt on behalf of his people. In chapter 10, we'll see how Judah responds to Ezra's prayer, and we'll see whether or not they are repentant or whether they just want to continue on in their sins. Now, let's talk about application. We don't want to be like the people of Judah in repeating these sins. It had only been 2 generations, think about that, 2 generations since the people of Judah had been allowed to return to their homeland, and they were already committing the same sins that had gotten their forefathers expelled from it. It is so easy to repeat the mistakes of the past, especially if we're not being careful about not repeating them. Human nature seems to work in cycles, and this is one of the things that the Bible reveals to us. And repeating the sins of our ancestors seems to be part of that cycle. For proof of that, just go through the book of Judges. It's really hard to predict the future and to anticipate the problems that we as individuals and collective Christians will face in years to come. But one of the best ways to guard ourselves against future temptations might be actually to look back in time to the sins that plagued our grandparents and to prepare for similar temptations to make a reappearance as the cycle of human nature resets and begins to repeat itself. The Bible's divine explanation of human behavior and a good history book are better than any crystal ball will ever be at forecasting what awaits us in the future. Thanks for joining me today for Ezra 9. I hope to see you back tomorrow as we finish up the book in chapter 10.